Chapter 16. Choices. Morning dawned with the prince still holding watch, his mind whirling with thoughts. He hadn't been able to sleep, and, in any case, he felt he owed a full night's rest to Thomas and Leah for carrying him all this way. Leah was the first to stir, waking with a luxurious stretch like a cat. She opened her eyes and rolled over, taking in the banked fire and the sleeping form of Thomas, and then the prince.
"Have you been on watch all night?"
she asked, sleep coloring her voice. The prince couldn't help but smile at the unfeigned surprise in her tone. "Yes," he said. It felt fair. I've been sleeping for a while, it seems." "Huh, all right," she said. Then, in one fluid motion, she rose to her feet, the blanket dropping off of her, and she walked over to wake Thomas. The prince went to the saddlebags and pulled out more bread and cheese for breakfast. He was pleased that his hands weren't shaking. They ate their meal in silence, enjoying the food and the brisk morning air. "What's our plan for moving on?" the prince asked, bracing himself. "We're going to make for the Pass of Rourke," Thomas said. "There are a few passes through the mountains that we can use to cross. They're patrolled by rotating squads of men from Rourke, but if we're quick, we'll be able to make it across the border before they even know we're there. Then we head to Vale." "No," the prince said. Leah and Thomas stopped eating. "What do you mean, no?" Leah asked, eyes flashing. "I mean you were right, Leah. I'm not one of you," he said. "I can't let my personal injustices at the hands of the Empire make me believe rebellion is the right course of action. So, I won't be going with you through the pass. I won't be going to Vale." They sat staring at him with incredulity. "The Empire is good," he said. "It's good for the people who live under its rule, it's good for the development of the land, it's good for the majority. And while you've saved me on multiple occasions, I will never rebel against the lawful rule of the Diamond Throne. I am grateful." The word caught in his throat, but he forced it out. "And you have given me much to think about. But my place is in the Empire. I am a prince of the realm as long as I bear the Raven Talisman, and I cannot turn my back on my responsibility." A long silence followed this pronouncement. Finally, the girl stood up, staring at him, and the prince knew that she felt vindicated. Here he was making all of the arguments that she had made last night. "And what about the slave auction you saw in Bainland?" He flinched back as if she'd physically hit him. The memory came back to him, unbidden, and he was once more nauseated. "Yes, I know you saw it, I know you were there," she said. "You've seen the kind of men the Empire employs, scum like the Defenders. You saw that they were going to take me to Formeau and would have held me and tortured me until I was dead, simply because it would hurt my father and give them leverage. You've seen now what the Empire does to people." "Yes," the prince snapped back, "and that is why I am needed here. I can't just run away from all of that. I can't just give up and leave the Empire to run off and become a rebel. Do you know how many of the Most High ever leave Lucien to see the Empire? How many ever leave their own province to visit a neighboring one if they do not need to? If I can make them see the world they've unknowingly created, then I can make the Empire better. And when you return and they kill you, what then? Well, what does it matter to you anyway? I thought it was too risky to bring me back to your precious Vale in the first place." The words were out before he could stop them, and Leah took a step back, apparently surprised by the hurt and reproach she heard in his voice. He took a deep breath. This arguing was getting him nowhere. "In any case, you've gotten your wish. I'm not going with you." "Your intentions are good, princeling," Thomas rumbled, a look of near panic on his face, as if things were quickly getting out of hand. "But you had never left the capital city yourself until a very short while ago. You do not know how this world works. As soon as your name was taken from you, you were made into an outcast. And even if you wish to return to change things for the better, there are men and armies after you as we speak. You've killed Defenders. You've destroyed Death Watchmen. The life of a blood mage is on your hands. You've defied your mother's orders to return to the capital, ignored the commands of a seeker, and saved the lives of 2 exiled kindred." The prince shook his head. "It was wrong. It was all wrong. I can't just run away. I can't turn my back on my people, on the Empire." "It has turned its back on you, princeling." "I won't run away." You'll just go back and get yourself killed, Leah muttered. I should have known. Stupid men, why couldn't we have kidnapped one of your sisters? You wouldn't want to meet my sisters, the prince said, shaking his head ruefully at the thought of Leah and Samantha in the same room. They can't be any worse than you. Enough, both of you, Tomas said. A silence fell, as both Leah and the prince turned away and pretended to be very interested in the trees surrounding the clearing. If you wish to go, then we cannot stop you. The prince looked quickly at the big man. Tomas was clearly disappointed by this turn of events, but just as clearly resigned to it. There was a deep sadness in his eyes, and the prince looked away again, feeling as though he were betraying the man in some way. Yes, we can keep him. We did it once, we can do it again, Leah said. No, we cannot, Eshendai, Tomas said. We are being pursued by the Empire in force now. Things were different when we had a reasonable chance of passing through the Empire by stealth, but how can we tie up the Prince of Ravens and take him through not only the Pass of Rourke, but past the personal seat of the Prince of Oxen, who will have gotten the message days, if not weeks ago, that his brother is heading straight toward him? It's common sense, and if you use your head, you'd know it better than I do. Calm yourself and consider the situation. For a long moment it looked as though Leah would just ignore Tomas. But as the prince watched, the anger seemed to drain out of her, and her face grew calm and still. Her hands continued to clench and unclench by her sides, but eventually those too relaxed, and the prince breathed more easily. You're right, she said finally. The benefits we could receive from his information do not outweigh the danger of not returning. The elders need our report. We can't take the risk of being caught by a border patrol. She turned to the prince. We can't let you go now, she said, and he tensed. But once we reach the road again near Rourke, we can part there. How long? The prince asked. A few days at most, she responded, her eyes now focused past him as if seeing something in her memory. It's far enough past Rourke that you won't be detected by the Prince of Oxen's forces, and it's close enough to the pass that we can continue on without any added inconvenience. She caught his gaze. And then you can go get yourself killed in whatever way you want, she said, the anger coming back to the surface. She turned away and began to pack her bedroll. The prince looked over at Tomas, but the big man had begun making his way to the river to fill the water skins one last time before they left. The three of them climbed onto their horses in silence soon after, the sun rising quickly in the sky, and set off toward Rourke. The next few days passed in almost total silence. The prince did not feel much like talking, so he kept silent unless a question was asked of him, and that was seldom enough as it appeared Tomas and Leah were just as reluctant to speak. The prince made a habit of reaching through the talisman every night and every morning, though, searching for any sign of people following them, but time and again he found only the three of them in the middle of the giant forested mountain range. The mountains began to become more noticeable as well, the ground dipping less and less often back towards sea level and instead continuing to climb. The prince knew from lessons in geography that the Rourke mountain range was easily twice the size of the El Mists, and that passage straight over the top of them was next to impossible. He also knew that the Pass of Rourke itself was heavily guarded by Ramael's forces. He wondered how the exiles were going to get around them. None of my business now, he reminded himself firmly. One night as they began to make camp while the sun was still in the sky, the prince broached a subject that had been on his mind. Leah had disappeared into the trees, muttering something to Tomas but not acknowledging the prince's presence. Do you think we're still being followed? The prince asked Tomas. The big man looked up from starting a fire and raised an eyebrow at him. It's not that I doubt your word, the prince said. It's just that it seems like we're the only ones for miles. As a matter of fact, I can tell you that much for certain. I haven't caught the slightest hint of the odd hunter or shepherd for days now. Tomas looked at him thoughtfully for a moment before letting out a long sigh. I've been wondering that as well, truth be told. It's something of a curiosity that we haven't caught hint of trouble sooner. I can only assume that they're unsure exactly where we are. We're almost a week past Lake Chartain, the prince insisted, and we haven't caught any sign of anyone. Maybe we got away clean this time. It's possible, don't you think that... The prince cut off mid-sentence. Something, as if summoned by their conversation, was coming. He turned quickly, looking through the trees out over the side of the mountain. There appeared to be nothing there, only landscape folding out from beneath them and out toward the horizon. But the prince was certain there was something. Why was he so sure, though? It wasn't a life, it was... What was it? "Don't I? Quiet," the prince said. He squinted as the wind picked up, blowing in his face. He reached out with his senses, using the raven talisman. He became more aware of the abundance of life around him, the mountain forest full of bright points of light, but they all bore the same hazy, undefined quality. No people, nothing nearby but animals. Farther away, perhaps? He closed his eyes and knelt down to focus. He sent his mind out, questing in every direction, ranging over the forested mountains down to the bottom of the valley. Nothing. It appeared that they were alone. Wait. There. It was so far away that he almost couldn't sense it, a bright point of light coming toward them. But it wasn't a single point. It seemed to move and pulsate just beyond his vision, expanding and contracting strangely as if moving in disparate parts. And then he understood. "They found our trail," he said, standing quickly, "and they're following with an army. That must be why we haven't seen or heard them in so long. They've been gathering together. My guess is that they have half the countryside covered. They're still several miles away. I can barely feel them, but they're coming." "Are you certain?" Thomas asked. The prince nodded. Thomas didn't hesitate. "Find Leah," he said, before beginning to quickly repack the campsite. The prince set off around the side of the mountain in the direction the girl had headed. He closed his eyes, and the talisman picked her up, pointing him toward a river that came down from the mountain top. He burst through the trees, already launching into an explanation of what was happening. Leah was standing up to her knees in the river, her clothes piled carelessly on a rock beside her. The prince's mind went suddenly blank. Her midnight black hair fell halfway down her back, shining and clinging to her light olive skin in a shimmering wave, glints of deep blue highlighted by the rays of the sun. Her skin glistened with water droplets from the stream, and she stood, back straight, arms spread wide to either side, drinking in the sun, the mountainside, and the miles of landscape spread out before her. A wind whipped through the trees, racing across the clearing as if to embrace her, and she breathed it in. She seemed to shine with an inner light, her eyes closed, her mouth open, and her jaw slack. Cold dimpled her skin, but she didn't cover herself. She stood in the rushing water as much a part of the world as the wind, the river, and the earth itself. Without warning, she whipped around and locked eyes on him. The prince didn't remember having walked forward, but he now stood at the bank of the river. He wasn't sure what he expected to happen, perhaps for her to yell at him, or for her to run for her clothes, maybe even attack him for invading her privacy. But she did none of these things. She just stared at him. After a moment she shifted slightly, and as the sun hit her from another angle, the prince's breath caught in his throat. Scars crisscrossed her body, some red, thick and ugly, others barely a razor's width and white, nearly invisible. Some were clearly scars from battle, but many of them were long whip scars, their latticed crossings along her arms and stomach and shoulders standing out as if branded into the skin. She had been beaten, horribly. Horror and revulsion seized him, not at her disfigurement, but at the person who had done such a thing. His stomach knotted up and anger rose in his throat, choking him. She pierced him with her eyes, daring him to look away, daring him to defy the evidence of the Empire's cruelty. She took a step forward, the muscles in her legs bunching and stretching with a steely, coiled grace. Her hands slowly lifted to each side. She inclined her head and bent forward at the waist. She was bowing to him. "Your mother's legacy, my prince," she said, voice emotionless but gaze so intense it felt like a hand squeezing his heart and lungs, making it impossible to speak, impossible to breathe. "Be glad that you can choose to ignore it. Some of us were never given the chance." Something about those words broke through his clouded mind, and he dropped his gaze to the ground, looking anywhere but at her. "Thomas," he said, his voice coming out in a croak. He swallowed and started again. We're breaking camp. They found our trail. We're leaving. Thomas sent me to find you. I'll see you back there." He turned and ran, not even waiting to see if she would follow him. When he reached Thomas, he was out of breath, but the ex-blade master didn't seem to notice. "Where's Leah?" he asked. "Coming," the prince said. "Good," the big man responded, finishing the packing. Leah burst into the clearing not a minute later, once more clothed, and without hesitation jumped onto her horse. "This way," she called out as she spurred her mount through the trees. As they rode, the prince could feel the men behind them hot on their trail. They rode around the lip of the mountain before dipping into a small valley that split into two paths at the end. When they reached the fork, the prince realized the path to the right led downward, and in the distance he could see the mountains that gave way to a large thoroughfare with a steady amount of traffic on it. The road to Rourke. "That's the way back to the main road," Tomas said, pointing the way the prince was looking. "This is where we part ways. Hopefully they will split their force and we will both have an easier time of avoiding them." The prince looked at the trail leading down the mountain and turned his horse to go. But he paused. He had to know. He turned back and looked at Leah. "How did you get those scars?" he asked. Her eyes widened slightly. In surprise or anger, the prince couldn't tell. She shifted her hands on her horse's reins. Tomas's eyes narrowed. "What do you know about scars, boy?" "It's fine, Tomas," Leah said, looking back over her shoulder. The prince didn't need to follow her gaze to know that the army was closer. He could feel them growing nearer every second. "I lived in the city of Tyne until I was 11, she said, turning back to him, words hurried but clear. "The Empress came to visit. I put on my best dress and went out with my family to watch. When she passed where we were expected to bow. I forgot. So I was left standing, smiling up at this beautiful figure on a beautiful white horse. I was so happy to be standing there, finally able to see her. And then, guards seized me. I was taken out of the crowd and brought to the center of the town and whipped with a lash by the Prince of Lions himself. My family took me home and whipped me as well, all the while telling me what a terrible girl I was, and at the same time that I should be grateful. You see, it was an honor to be beaten by one of the children, an honor to be recognized by the Empress even if it was for punishment. I came within an inch of death for bringing shame on my family. My father, he spat on me as he left the room, leaving me hanging from chains where slaves were whipped for disobedience. He was a member of the Most High, those virtuous men and women you hope to convert to your cause. My mother made no comment. She didn't need to. I could see what she thought of me, clear as day. It was written across her face. When I recovered, I ran. Her eyes were blazing with emerald fire as if she dared him to say anything. You can go back to your precious empire, she spat. But I know what they'll do to you. I know what they did to an innocent girl who wanted to believe in glory and hope and ideals. Go. And when they kill you, when you watch them slice you open with no remorse in their eyes, I hope you'll finally understand that the world is made of people like us who see evil and fight it, and people like you who see evil and excuse it. She wheeled her horse around and launched herself up the mountainside. Tomas shot him one last look, held his gaze, and nodded. And then he followed her, spurring his own mount even harder to catch up. The prince watched them until they disappeared into the mountain forest, numb, empty, feeling the need to go, to escape the pursuing men, but knowing, deep down in his heart, that once he did, his path was set. Part of him had known, all along, that what Leah had just told him was true. If he went back, he would die. There was no hope for him. And still, knowing this, he turned his horse toward the path that led down the mountain. The horse began to trot, and the path fell away, and suddenly, not knowing why, maybe just wanting one last impression of the two exiles, his companions, his friends, he thrust his mind through the raven talisman and sent his consciousness up to them, following them along the road that led higher up the mountain. He watched them go in his mind's eye, feeling their life dwindle as they rode away. They were almost gone, gone forever. Sudden as a flash of lightning, he felt another life spring into being in the direction they had gone. He jerked back, shocked. There had been nothing, and now there was a growing life energy focused on a single point at the top of the mountain. At first the prince thought he was seeing things, but the life continued to grow. To grow? How was that possible? Understanding hit him, cold and hard, and numbed him with terrible fear. Only one thing left that kind of signature, and they were riding straight toward it. He looked down the right-hand fork toward the distant road, the path duty would lead him to. He looked back up, the way Tomaz and Leah had gone, and sensed again the growing, malevolent life. In panic, he looked behind him and felt the enormous multitude of men combing through the forest, making sure he wouldn't slip through their net this time. He wouldn't have time to come back this way if he didn't take the trail down the mountain now. Shadows and light, he growled. What does it matter, he thought. They're only exiles. They chose this life. But anger struck him like a bolt of lightning and cleared his mind. It consumed his well-thought-out arguments and plans, and in that instant he knew where he belonged. He kicked his boots into the side of the horse and rocketed up the mountainside. He could feel the energy of the new life still growing, and he knew it wasn't over yet. Thunder sounded in the sky above him, and he saw black clouds forming over the mountain summit. Too fast. He wouldn't reach them in time. He urged all the speed he could out of his mount, climbing higher and higher, leaving the road to Rourke far behind, racing against the building clouds. If it started to rain, the process would be complete, and the monster would become corporeal. Trees flew past him as he tracked both the life energy of the exiles and kept a check on the life of the creature. The trail was leading him well up into the mountains, high enough that the wind whipping past him cut straight through his layers of clothing. His horse was frothing at the mouth, but he continued to push it mercilessly forward. Faster, he urged it. The exiles were close. He looked up and saw the clouds converging on a spot not too far ahead of him. His horse came to a small clearing in the midst of a grove of trees, and there they were, moving at a steady trot 20 yards away. Stop! The exiles turned in their saddles to look back, barely slowing as they did. When they saw that it was him, though, they reined in their horses. Tomaz roared at the prince over the rising storm. What in the name of the seven hells are you doing here? There's a demon right in front of you! The prince yelled back. They both stared at him blankly, keeping a tight rein on their horses as they tried to keep them calm against the force of the rising wind. Lightning and thunder broke through the clouds and momentarily blinded the prince and left his ears ringing. Rain began to fall, and he looked up at the sky, heart pounding. The clouds began to circle in on each other, and lightning and thunder rocked the world once more. The black clouds parted, and an enormous shape plummeted toward them. The storm demon crashed into the ground in front of them, lightning shooting across the ground in sheets. The prince dove behind a tree, and the raw energy shot past him, leaving his muscles limp and jerky. He forced himself back up, looking around frantically for Leah and Tomaz, hoping that they had found cover across the clearing. The prince turned and looked at the creature before him. The creature was nearly 20 feet tall and made of a blinding white substance that the prince knew to be the essence of the storm itself. It wore a white helm shaped like a crown, made of razor-sharp shards of ice and flickering pulses of lightning, around a skeletal head, out of which glared eyes that were pockets of ice. It was clothed in blue and white armor and a cloak that flowed like storm clouds, gray and misty. Hands like claws, each of the fingers as long as one of the prince's arms, held a staff as long as it was tall. One side a pointed, wicked-looking saber blade, the other end a cruel spear point. The entire length crackled with raw lightning. The demon drew a deep breath, and the air in the clearing rushed toward it, a mighty wind that tore at the prince's clothing. He knew of no way to defeat a demon that did not involve killing the blood mages who had created it, and as distance mattered little when there was a full circle of 12 summoning a demon, the mages could be halfway to the castle of Rourke for all he knew. All that they could do now was run. The prince saw the exiles looking out from behind a tree not too far from him. Hoping against hope that the demon wouldn't notice him, he took off running as fast as he could in their direction. There was a roar of surprise as the demon caught the motion. The prince dove behind the tree hiding Tomaz and Leah just as the creature brandished its staff, shooting a crackling bolt of lightning through the spot the prince had been. The prince ran headlong into Tomaz's chest and stumbled back. Big arms shot out and steadied him. "We need to run! Now!" he shouted over the rushing storm. Lightning and thunder cracked again, and the top of the tree was severed from the trunk and came crashing down nearly on top of them. "We need Valerium!" Leah said. She was peering around the edge of the tree as if planning to fight off the monster. The prince grabbed her by the cloak and pulled her back, turning her around to shout in her face. "What in the Empress's name is Valerium?" he cried. The answer was lost as the rest of the tree was uprooted when the storm demon attacked again. The prince was suddenly airborne, thrown across the clearing. He landed with a bone-rattling thud on a tree root that dug into his back and tore his breath away. He choked and tried to push himself to his feet, but the demon was there, hurricane winds twisting around its head as a clawed, blue and gray foot shot out and pinned him to the ground. The prince let out a cry of pain and struggled in vain to free himself, the heat already seeping from his blood as the cold bit deeply into his body. He looked up into the icy, enchanted eyes of the elemental and knew there was nothing he could do to save himself. The demon raised its staff, lightning crackling along its length, and then brought it down. The prince closed his eyes and waited for the end. But it didn't come. Instead, there was a piercing cry of pain from above him, like that of lightning ripping open the fabric of the sky, and the prince opened his eyes. The demon reared back and turned, a dazzling white dagger sticking out of its neck, just below the edge of its crown-shaped helm. A figure burst from concealment, a sword like white flame held in one hand. The demon charged the figure, roaring in rage and pain. That alone was enough to stun the prince. He had never seen a demon in pain before. The figure dodged, and the sword lanced out to the prince's continued amazement in the complicated sword form of Wolf on the Mountain, flawlessly allowing the figure to dodge the demon while slicing through the blue and white armor. Another flash of white caught the prince's eye, and he looked over and saw a second figure, nearly as large as Tomaz, wielding an enormous axe made of the same white metal. The figure reared back and then hurled the axe through the air. The axe swung through a large arc and lopped one of the demon's arms clean off. A terrible scream rent the air, a howling and tearing that resounded with the raw power of thunder and the piercing shriek of wind. The demon swung its staff, lightning branching from the saber's blade, but the figure dodged back and rolled to the side just as the flash of energy shot over its head, ripping into a pine tree and shattering it into 1,000 flying bits of kindling. The smaller figure took a running leap and threw its white sword through the air. The sword flew completely straight, as if a force were pushing it directly through the intervening space. And, with a scraping, ear-splitting crack, it plunged into the creature's neck, just below the crown-shaped helm. As it sunk in, the white metal seemed to pulse, and the demon appeared to swell. With a final, heaving cry, the elemental exploded into 1,000 shards of ice that went flying in as many directions. The prince, Leah, and Tomaz threw themselves to the ground, hands covering their heads. Lightning flashed and thunder roared. The prince felt a searing force and an accompanying percussive boom that rocked his body and exploded in his ears. Everything became still and deadly quiet. The prince lifted the edge of his drape-over, which had blown up over his head, and looked to where the demon had been. Where the creature had stood was now a blasted heath, and in the sky the scattered clouds of a dying storm. The prince felt his head lift, almost involuntarily, as if it were metal being drawn by a living lodestone. His eyes flew across the ground, trying to locate the two figures that had saved them, the two figures that had killed that which should have been immortal. There. "David!" He gaped in surprise as Leah shot across the clearing toward the smaller of the two figures, laughing in a way he had never seen. The smaller figure resolved into a tall, lean young man, returning a gleaming white sword to a sheath slung across his back and a long white dagger to a loop at his belt. "Leah!" the young man cried, wrapping her up in a tight embrace. "Lorna," rumbled Tomaz. The prince looked at him, and then at the bigger figure to whom he was nodding, and noticed it was a woman. She had short-cropped light hair that was cut as if a bowl had been placed over her head and all of the hair sticking out had simply been sheared off. She walked forward with a lumbering gait that reminded the prince of the bears sometimes brought to the fortress for court entertainment. "I've always told you should carry Valerium with you," the young man said to Leah with a roguish smile. "Good against elementals," Leah responded, "but I prefer steel against everything else." Now that is complete and utter idiocy that I cannot accept, particularly coming from my sister. "Sister?" the prince asked, still trying to process what was happening. Both of them turned to look at him, and with a shock the prince realized that they were almost identical. Leah's brother was obviously male, and taller and more muscled, but he had the same lean, wiry body type as Leah did, and was about as close to a male translation of Leah as one could imagine. One clear difference, though, was that the brother had shining, scarlet pupils that were shockingly unnatural. The prince had seen eyes like that among the Most High, and the blood mages, but never among the baseborn. "What's this? You don't usually pick up strays," the young man said, looking the prince up and down and smiling as if at a private joke. The red eyes seemed to mock him, and the prince couldn't help but think of the red crystal the blood mages carried to perform their magic. The young man radiated a kind of easy and infectious charisma, as if he expected everything in life to go his way. "He's a friend," Tomas said. They all turned to look at the big man as he approached. He was followed by the young man's female companion, and they had 5 horses in tow, 2 of which were quite obviously bred for speed, as opposed to the 3 Leah had taken from the defenders that were glorified pack horses. "Oh ho, a friend," the young man said. "Where do you come from, and what could have possibly convinced my sister to keep you in her company? She would rather travel with a talking parrot than another person." He smiled mockingly at Leah. Leah ignored him and stared directly at the prince, who felt his throat go dry. A few awkward seconds passed, wherein the prince just managed to prevent himself from swallowing nervously. Was she going to reveal who he was? He wasn't supposed to be there. They weren't supposed to have met anyone. They hadn't discussed any of this because this wasn't supposed to be happening. "He's one of Tomas's projects," she said finally. "He fell in with us when we were passing through the El Mist Mountains. He's a runaway, from a family of the Most High. His name is... Raven." "Raven," David said, tasting the word. "Like the bird?" "Weird." The prince held Leah's gaze and tried to convey his gratitude without words, but whether she understood or not, she gave no sign. The young man said, looking back and forth between the two of them. He stepped forward abruptly with a smile that seemed to mock both the prince and himself and offered his hand. "David Goldwyn," he said. Slowly, the prince reached out and grasped the hand, noticing that it was slim but nonetheless covered in calluses that belied constant work with a sword. He reached out briefly through the raven talisman, but felt nothing special about the man, aside from the fact he was strong and vibrant. How had he managed to destroy a demon? "Raven," the prince said, taking Leah's lead. "And this is Lorna," David said, dropping the prince's hand and motioning to the woman who had come up with Tomas. She had retrieved the large battle axe from where the demon's death had flung it and wore it slung on her back just like Tomas wore his sword. The prince was shocked to find that she stood only a head shorter than the big man. She was even more of a novelty than Tomas was in the prince's world. All guardians were men. He had never seen a woman on the same scale before. Lorna grunted and nodded to the prince before turning to David. Her voice was low and husky. "Eshendai, there's a force coming on us very quickly. It looks to be several thousand strong, all light cavalry with mounted archers." "How do you know that? They must be a mile away still," the prince blurted out, reaching out and sensing the army still far away but certainly gaining. "Ignore him," Leah said with a long-suffering look. "He thinks he's a tracker, but he has no idea what he's talking about." The prince knew that she was playing a part, but still it made his cheeks burn, and he cursed himself for not thinking his words through. He couldn't know about the pursuit without the talisman. If he wasn't careful, the new exiles would start asking questions he wouldn't be able to answer. David smirked at him and gave him a sympathetic look that seemed to say he knew how his sister could be sometimes. "Is there a cache of supplies nearby?" Leah asked. "No," David responded, "and you're not going much further on those horses, so the normal route is out." For a moment, the two of them stood silently thinking, and then David clicked his tongue and made for his mount. "The bridge." Leah's eyes widened. "It's finished already." "Indeed," David said with another rakish smile. "We were part of the first scouting party sent across. We were trying to navigate a path through the area. It's ringed with blood mage traps like that stormwalker." "I should have rechecked the area before running through," Leah said angrily. "I led us right into it. I was so focused on... Never mind." The prince's eyes flicked in her direction, and he saw small spots of color light on her cheeks, but the young man didn't seem to notice. "No worries, sister mine," David said. "We'll lead them up to the higher pass, cross the bridge, cut the restraints. We should have enough time to get there, and they won't be able to follow us. We'll have to repair it eventually, but since winter will be on us soon and the pass will be closed for months, we can deal with it later." "The elders will take us to task for ruining what was just built," said the large woman, Lorna. Her mouth didn't move much when she spoke. In fact, it barely opened, which made her words come out in a kind of growl that took a minute to understand. "You're right, but there's no help for it," Leah said simply. She looked at Tomas, who nodded his assent, and they all mounted, the prince remaining silent, seeing no way forward but to go with the group for now. He had to stay out of reach of the army. He'd made his choice back at the crossroads. Even though they would have been fine without me, he realized. These two would have been able to fend off the demon. I didn't help at all. His mood turned black, and he was glad that they all traveled in silence. He struggled to keep a sudden wave of despair from crashing over him. He focused on breathing and pulled out his anger again, which gave him energy and focus. He would find another way out. He would. They made their way out of the clearing and continued upward. As they ascended, the temperature continued to drop, and soon they were passing patches of snow. The prince pulled his drape over closer about him and settled the hood over his head. It helped, but there was no keeping the cold out entirely, and he soon began to shiver. They continued without stopping for the better part of the afternoon, keeping up a quick trot along a narrow hunting trail, working their way through territory treacherous enough that the army coming up behind them would no doubt be forced to slow to a crawl to maneuver their larger numbers, if they could follow at all. At one point they passed along a ridge that afforded them a view of a castle and a city, far down at the entrance to a large pass through the mountain range. The castle and city of Rourke. The prince reached out and felt the life of his brother Ramael, even from the large distance. The ox talisman endowed his brother with enhanced physical strength and power, and he was positioned here in the southernmost province because of that fact. He was not the general that Ricard was, but he was the most unforgiving and brutal of all the children. His physical strength was matched only by his force of will, and he had never been defeated on the open battlefield. The exiled only managed to keep him on this side of the pass because he could not bring his full force to bear on them. They were able to hide by stringing his forces along with ambushes and false trails that led to nowhere. Suddenly the prince realized the significance of what was about to happen. He was about to pass into the lands of the exiled kindred, a place where none of his siblings and none of the subjects of the empire had been for centuries. "Why did you come back?" Leah asked him. The prince looked up. She was frowning at him. He had fallen behind the group of exiles and she had fallen back with him. "You needed help," he said. "You didn't know the demon was coming. I thought I could warn you in time and we could get away before—" He trailed off and shrugged. "Guess that didn't work particularly well," she said. They exchanged a glance, and his black mood inexplicably lightened. He laughed, ruefully. "I suppose not." She smiled at him. It was small and tentative, but it was a smile. He turned away from the view of Rourke and began to ride forward again. She waited and then fell in beside him. They rode along together for a stretch of time, not saying anything. Finally, he broke the silence. "And I couldn't ignore what I'd seen," he said. He kept his head firmly facing forward. She did too, and when she spoke it was with a pausing awkwardness that was very unlike her. "You could have. Ignored it, I mean. None of your brothers and sisters would have even given it a second thought. And none of them would have listened to what I said, for which I apologize. I said it in anger. There is no need for apologies. And I know that none of the other children would have come to help you. But the more time I spend away from them, the more I realize I'm not very much like them." They lapsed back into silence, following David, Tomaz, and Lorna. A few minutes later they rounded a boulder completely covered in snow and ice, and she spoke again, the heat of her breath misting the air. "I know you didn't want to come with us," she said, her tone taking on a steely quality, as if expecting a fight. "But it doesn't look like you have much of a choice, and I should tell you that once you cross over into kindred lands, you won't be able to come back." He looked up sharply. "What?" He pulled on his reins, and the horse came to an abrupt stop amidst a small cloud of dislodged snow and earth. Leah pulled up as well. The others heard the noise and turned. Leah held up a hand to keep them from coming back, and then turned to him again. "We don't allow people to leave the exiled lands. Once someone has crossed through the pass or over the mountains with us, they must remain in Vale, unless the elders agree that they can leave. And how long would it take to get their permission?" "It's not a matter of time," she said. "It's a matter of trust." He looked at her for a long moment, and then to Tomaz waiting further up the trail. He reached back with his mind and felt the army of the Empire still following them. The choice appeared very simple on its face. Go forward with the exiles, or be captured and likely taken to his death. And perhaps it was that simple. What other choice did he have? "Fine," he said. "Fine." She held his gaze, and he realized that she knew how much the decision meant to him. She nodded slowly. "Okay," she said. Together, they turned their horses and continued on. Leah waved to the group ahead, and they moved out. A shiver ran through the prince that had nothing to do with the cold. His mind tried to whirl into action, but he stopped it. He couldn't think right now. He just had to act. They came to the bridge not long afterwards. It was a simple thing, made of wood and rope coated in tar and resin to provide a steady footing and to outlast the elements. It was thick enough and wide enough that the horses could cross, and the prince was surprised at the quality of the construction. They all dismounted and blindfolded their mounts in preparation for the crossing. As he stepped onto the wood and began to lead his horse across, his heart pounded in his chest. The bridge was barely 50 feet across, and it was sturdy enough that he felt no worry of falling, even though they were suspended better than 1,000 feet in the air and below them yawned a shadowy abyss. No, what had his heart knocking against his ribs was the realization of what he was doing, that with each step he was further confirming his decision. Once they were on the other side, Tomaz and Lorna destroyed the wooden restraints that held the bridge in place, and then began to saw through the ropes that had held it up. After a quarter of an hour, with a sharp sound of snapping fibers, the thick rope unwound and split, and the bridge fell into the chasm, crashing and resounding off the steep stone walls. The 4 exiles all breathed a noticeable sigh of relief, but the prince did not. He followed them as they made their way through the mountain pass on the other side of the chasm, and soon they began to make their way back downward, this time on the other side of the mountain range. For the first time in the history of the empire, a prince of the realm had crossed peacefully into the 7th principality.